I know, Maria, especially when you hear bios like ours, I think a lot of people out there might think that we literally emerge from our mother's wombs with the microphone in hand. And there are people like that within the world of broadcasting, but I'm curious to hear how radio and the media shaped your life when it came into your world and how when you got into this world of broadcasting.
So first, it's great to be here. Thanks for choosing us instead of the vice presidents. I think we're better looking, actually.
And less quarrelsome.
I was born in Mexico City. I was raised in Chicago. And the radio was actually on in our home all the time. My mom was, at that time, a stay-at-home mom. And the radio was just on when she was doing whatever she was doing. Later, Mom decided she wanted to work outside of the home, which was actually one of the most challenging times in our home, from a very traditional Mexican family to Mom suddenly saying she wanted to go work. So that was very interesting. But we consumed media all the time in my home. We consumed journalism, television, radio, and yet we never saw ourselves there. We were just invisible from those stories. So that, I think, really planted a little seed in me as to say, why do we love journalism in my home, but why do we never see anybody like us actually giving the news or stories about people like us? So there was one day when I was in high school, I was in my room on the south side of Chicago with the radio, and I was flipping up with the dial, and it ended up on a public radio station. And they were talking about Latin America. And they were talking about Latin America in a way that was, they weren't yelling at me. And I was like, oh my God, my life has changed. And it was public radio, and it was a show that was dealing with Latin America. And I just remember feeling like my life had changed. Like there was a way in which you could receive journalism through the radio that wasn't bombarding you with the top 40 or just yelling at you. And I think soon after that, I ended up at the University of Chicago bookstore in my neighborhood in Hyde Park. And Susan Stamberg, the then anchor of All Things Considered, had just published a book called Every Night at 5. And I went in and I looked at that book and I saw her behind a microphone and I was like, God, what a cool life. But truth is that there were no Latinos or Latinas, well, no Latinas, a few Latinos who were doing journalism at the time. So I really didn't think that I could do it, Alex. There was just nothing that said, you can do this too. Ended up doing college radio at Barnard College. Yes. Thank you. And then ended up getting an internship at NPR at All Things Considered, and that allowed me to begin to think that, that maybe the perspective that I had actually had a role to play in American journalism.
I, too, was an intern at NPR in Washington, D.C., and I know it's an amazing place to be. We call it the mothership for a reason, but it can be intimidating, especially when you're starting off there as an intern, and you knew, obviously, something which NPR is all about in this day and age, that it was important to have other voices, different voices. But how comfortable did you feel piping up and saying, hey, have you ever thought about doing a story about this or that?
It's a great question, Alex. That's why you're good at what you're good at your job, because nobody's actually asked me that, or it's been a while. So I actually, when we met earlier today with a group of women students, I actually put it right back on them, and I talked about the privilege that you have and what you have to use that privilege to do. So I was the first Latina at NPR, except for women who were cleaning the bathrooms, which is funny, but not actually. And it was 1985. And actually for me, Barnard, the women's college, was the seal of approval. I literally felt like it was a stamp on my forehead that allowed me to get that job. And so I immediately understood that it was not about my level of discomfort, of which there was a lot. I didn't get any of the jokes. I was like, that was funny. That was where you're supposed to. And so I literally remember forcing myself in those editorial meetings to say, put up your hand. Put up your hand. You got, and ugh, and then I'd be just like, ugh, you know. And then I'd offer a story idea about something that they, you know, for example, one of the first award-winning piece that I produced with Scott Simon when I was a producer for him was a piece about an immigrant detention center in Harlingen, Texas. Now that's very interesting. It's just that, you know, I am now doing the same kind of work about immigration detention centers. And the conditions are actually worse now than they were when I was producing for Scott Simon. But interestingly, I'm going to share a little story with you. I was a producer, and then very soon after being a producer, I decided I actually wanted to be a correspondent. And so I left. It was the only way to try to make that leap. So I left, and I actually ended up working at KPBS in San Diego. When I was finally hired as a correspondent for NPR in 1990, soon after there was some bad heroin that hit the streets of the South Bronx. Actually, bad heroin that hit the streets of the South Bronx, and there was a lot of overdosing and actually dying from overdosing that was happening all around the area. Because the people who used heroin in the South Bronx was a limited group, but the South Bronx was where people would come to buy their drugs. And so you had people dying in the suburbs of Long Island, of Westchester, of New Jersey, and Connecticut. And it was the South Bronx in the 1990s. It was, you know, rough and tumble. So I went to the headquarters, to the mothership, soon after I filed several of these reports about this bad heroin in the South Bronx. And someone who shall remain nameless, a very big NPR personality, came up to me and she said, "Oh my God, Maria, your reporting in the South Bronx has been extraordinary. But I have to ask you something. Weren't you afraid to be in those neighborhoods?" And I actually looked at her and I said, "No, I've actually lived in those neighborhoods." And I remember thinking at that moment, she would have never thought to ask me if I was afraid the first day that I stepped foot into NPR headquarters. And I was afraid. And I always thought about that in which to say, you know, we just have to value different people's perspectives. Like, I didn't want to judge her for asking me that question, but at the same time, I needed, in a way, and I never said to her, I wanted her to understand that there was a fear that I had, that she couldn't comprehend, but that was a fear that was valid. And being the first, which I have been in multiple occasions now, thankfully I'm not afraid anymore. But I do think it's important for us to realize that there are multiple ways to look at the reality that we're living through. And that notion of, well, there's only one and it's got to be objective is actually very, very tricky.
I think one of the best counterbalances to a fear like that, which I can only imagine, is knowing how important it was for you as the first, as anyone of Latino heritage to be there, was the fact that these stories needed to get out there, they needed to be told, and they needed to be told, I would imagine, with a certain perspective. And I think there's that initial, oh, well, it's great to have a Latina producer here. She can speak Spanish. There might be some of those logistic or technical things. Can you talk a bit about how, as you see it, what you were actually were able to bring to the table, especially back then as a pioneer, in terms of lived experience, the way you interacted with the people that you interviewed, the questions that you asked, the language with which you write your stories? I think a lot of times when we hear radio, we just assume, oh, they're just talking, and we do talk. But every single word that you hear in those reporter pieces, and you serve for some time as a reporter on NPR, they're very carefully edited and for a reason. What do you bring to that?
Well, I think the first thing is that I really understood, I came to understand the importance of my own perspective and my own life experience. And I think for a young Latina woman at that time, it was an empowering thing. It wasn't like there was a lot of people who I could look to who had been through this before to kind of learn how to do it. But strangely enough, I feel like right now, if you're a Latino journalist or Latina journalist in the United States of America, some of the challenges that we're facing now are in a way greater than what I was facing then, in the sense of trying to break through. Now, for Latino journalists and Latina journalists, and I don't use the term Latinx because I'm aware that to me, that implies really a younger generation, and I'm talking about what was happening when I was young, which is a million years ago, sort of. But now, if you're a Latino or Latina journalist, the notion of being looked at as suspicious or non-objective or somebody who has an agenda or a particular perspective that you are trying to push, that's kind of what we face today. Back then, there was, what I wanted to do was, in fact, to tell them these stories that I was experiencing. So for example, it was the 1980s. The United States was heavily involved militarily in Central America. And the way that story had been covered really was through journalists going to Central America, reporting on what was happening, but there was not a lot of reporting about what was happening with Central Americans who were already coming. Sounds familiar, right? Because we just experienced this again. And so we were doing stories about Salvadorans moving into Washington, D.C. when people were like, Salvadorans in Washington, what is that? Now, anybody who knows Washington, D.C. now knows that it is a Central American and a very Salvadoran city. We were doing some of the first reporting on that for NPR. I think that I just understood that my experience of growing up as the other was a valuable one. And as opposed to kind of walking around feeling like, God, I always feel like the other and I don't really fit in and what's that about? I think that the otherness of my experience allowed me and has allowed me to be a better journalist because I can identify with someone who feels like the other, someone who feels voiceless, someone who feels not necessarily included. And sometimes that otherness extends to people who I can understand, an undocumented immigrant, for example, but it also extends to people who are part of other groups, like, for example, the Aryan Nations or the KKK. You know, I've done some reporting about that part of our America, and I think if I had to tell you now the two groups that I'm most interested in kind of looking at and really reporting on, it is a part of white America that feels unheard. Some of them might be tied to those extremist groups. And the other sector that I'm really interested in, which I could have never imagined might have existed, are Latinos and Latinas who are supportive of someone like Donald Trump. So I want to understand those two heads. And I think that I, in my work, continually try to bring that innate curiosity, but one that also comes from the otherness of my experience. And when I talk about otherness, I really don't want to make it seem as powerlessness or disenfranchised, but simply as otherness. Because I really want to leave for you in particular that you all need to operate by using the power that you do have. And those of you who are here on this campus, you need to understand that you have power. So I'm hoping that anything that I'm saying is not instilling in you a sense of powerlessness, but rather one of absolute and total empowerment.
But Maria, I think anyone out there hears you're going to go out and interview a member of the Aryan Nation. You're going to go out there and interview a Latino who's a Trump supporter. How could you? What would you say? I'm really curious about this segment of America as well. Can you talk a little bit about your approach in doing this? Because, you know, certainly if you call certain people up and you tell them you're from the world of public broadcasting, you tell them your last name, that might be the end of the conversation right there. So two parts. How first do you get through that door to even get that conversation? And once you have it, how can you get what you need? How can you answer those questions even when their answers might be filled with hate towards people you love, people you care about, towards you?
So the first time I interviewed somebody who was affiliated with the Aryan movement was in Pennsylvania. And I'm trying to remember how I got his number by doing just, basic journalism, finding out like a tattoo shop in Allentown and calling up. And I wouldn't say my last name. I would just say, hey, this is Maria, and I work, and I'm trying to remember if I said NPR. But ultimately, it led me to connecting to a guy named Terry. And he agreed to meet me, and he knew what my name was. It was Maria Hinojosa. I don't know. He just agreed to see me. I think it was way before Google. So,
the internet has changed everything.
Yes, so he just said yes. I remember driving down to meet him at a steak shop, and we had a 4-hour lunch. And he was letting he had shaved his head, but he was letting the hair grow out because he had understood that actually skinheads with hair was actually a better way to kind of get involved in the masses as opposed to being a skinhead, which then would make him stand out. So he was all about, he was like, we're studying. We're not, we're going to create a revolution here. So those of us, we're going to school. We realize it's not about Doc Martens and killing just one person. It's about us getting to school and becoming history teachers and teaching your kids the history as we see it. He had Hitler tattooed on the side of his neck. He had SS tattooed under his left arm like the SS did. But I really liked him, Terry. I mean, I know. And this is like the thing about being a journalist is like that the curiosity of what somebody else is thinking can in some ways blind you from what you might be feeling. Because I'm just like, I just want to know about you, so tell me. So we had this great conversation. And in the end, what I did do, Alex, was I said to him, I was like, Terry, I know you like me. He was like, yeah, I like you. And I said, and I like you. We kind of like each other here. This is kind of weird, You know I'm Mexican, and I know you're not. And I said, but as a friend, what would you say to me as a friend about, how you see what's happening in the United States of America? And he said, well, we're all waiting for the race riot, right? We're all waiting for the race riots to start. We're prepared for that. And we're just waiting for the thing that's going to set it off. So he said, my advice to you as a friend, Maria, would be to actually leave the United States. I think that would be the safest thing, because when it really gets ugly here, you're not going to be somebody who I can save. And he said it really genuinely, just leave. And of course, actually 2 weeks after that was April 19th when Timothy McVeigh blew up the Oklahoma City bombing. And I remember thinking, well, actually, my editors immediately called me and said, find out which Muslims bombed Oklahoma City. And I was like, these are not Muslims. I had a lot of sources in the Muslim community in New York, and they were like, no. It turned out to be Timothy McVeigh. And I remember thinking, was this the thing? Was this the thing that was going to be the set-off for the race war? And in terms of Latinos who support Trump and Latinas who support Trump, I'm already doing those interviews. And I'm just really curious.
The Latinos who you speak to and who have spoken to who support Trump, what are they telling you about why?
So to be honest with you, I haven't spoken to one of them since the debate. So that's a challenge, because I think the debate really brought up particular issues. I think the question around, federal taxes and being smart by not paying them, several things that were said, and several things that were not said. The fact that there was no discussion at all around immigration. But when I have interviewed Trump supporters who are Latinos or Latinas, one of the first things they say is that he's a great businessman. Because that is a narrative that has been put out there, right? That he's a great businessman. And I think if you think of the American dream, in that view, then it couldn't be any better than this. Which is why I worked very hard at making it clear that a great businessman does not necessarily have anywhere from 6 to 4 bankruptcies. And now, of course, as we know, with what was just released. Others of them are very hardcore, just Republican Party. South Texas, a very strong kind of feeling about the Republican Party and allegiance to the Republican Party that is just, I don't want to say a blind allegiance, but very much party. Some of the other Latinos who I spoke to, police officers really appreciated Donald Trump's kind of law and order perspective. But when I try to get to the point of, but when he has said these things, how does that make you feel inside? Sadly, the response is kind of like, well, I don't agree with everything that he says. He probably doesn't believe everything that he says. You know, maybe he made a mistake. I don't really believe that that's the way he feels. And that kind of like, I just don't really believe that that's the way he feels, is where it's left off. And I think that that's, you know, the feeling part of it when you're faced with actually I was about to say the factual part of Donald Trump, but I'm like, no. The things that he has actually said are the, you know, how do you put those two things together? So I think we have to ask, the latest polling, as per Latino Decisions, is that 17% of the Latinos and Latinas who can vote support Donald Trump. 17%. Black voters, it's only 5% supporting Donald Trump. Black voters, the Black community is not the target in the Donald Trump campaign. Latinos, Mexicanos, immigrants are, and yet we're like, yeah, man, we're gonna give you 17%. What is that about? Is it about us feeling like we have to prove our love for this country so much, that we have to prove our allegiance so much, that we internalize so much that who we are is not a valuable part of this country? I mean, that's what I'm wondering. I'm not sure if that's the truth, but it's the thing that has me intrigued.
Maria, what do you see your role as a journalist in those conversations and in politics in general? I mean, you came up in an era where it was very clear reporters, hosts, they're impartial, they are objective no matter what the issue might be. Capital punishment, legalizing marijuana, abortion, you name it, we hold our cards very tight to our chest and we don't let anyone know. This election is unlike any other I've ever seen as a journalist, and I think a lot of journalists are really grappling with what they can say, when they can say it, how they react. How do you sort through those questions?
I mean, it's what I live every day. And I do not think that we, as a country, have had a deep national conversation about the role of media and journalists today. And I'm sad about that because we don't know what's going to happen, right? I mean, if Donald Trump wins, are we going to have the time to come back and say, like, whoa, what happened here? Were we a part of allowing this or making this happen? And if Hillary wins, we may not have the bandwidth to say, let's go back there and see what happened. But frankly, it is the question of the day. When I was in Kenya in 2008, a year after the elections of 2007, which were very bloody, and all of you know what happened in Rwanda in the 1990s. Rwanda is a neighbor of Kenya. You would have thought that Kenya would have learned the lesson of what happens when you have a media that is part of instigating, not reporting, but instigating, which is what happened in Rwanda when you had a Hutu-dominated media that was on the air every day calling Tutsis cockroaches. Every day. And they've had to kind of process what happened there. In Kenya, the journalists were actively putting information out that was increasing a kind of tribal separation between candidates that led to a very bloody post-2007 aftermath of the election. And the executive producers and news anchors that I met in Kenya at that time talked about practicing something called peace journalism, where they, as journalists, understood that their role was not to instigate, but if anything they wanted to instigate, it was peace. How would we feel if we had a conversation about American journalists operating as peace journalists? I think you can already hear that they would just be like, no, we can't do that. And yet, really? Is there a problem in that actually wanting the outcome to be a peaceful one? Not that you're walking away from debate or conflict, but wanting that there be peace. Is that a political agenda? Would Walter Cronkite have had a problem with that? Would Edward R. Murrow have had a problem with that? Would Frederick Douglass have had a problem with that? I don't know. I can just tell you that I have been myself sadly targeted because of this and criticized. And I've been told that I'm unpatriotic, that I have an agenda, that I am biased, that I'm an activist and an advocate, and all of these things that are very disempowering to any journalist. And in my core, what I say is, you want to label me as something because you want to label me that. But if there's only one thing that I'm an advocate for, it's actually for the Constitution, for our democracy, for due process, for facts. And one thing that I do like to do with my journalism is I do like to make people feel something. I do think that the notion of feeling is important. So somebody might say, well, that's an agenda. You know, you like to get into the emotion of a story. It's like, is that an agenda? I don't know. I relate to that kind of journalism when it touches my heart. But it is a critical time for us as journalists, and we don't have the answer. And we need to be having all of these kinds of conversations with our fellow journalists. And we need to understand that, you know, to say that there was like a moment of objectivity in our country, you know, with a Walter Cronkite, and you guys are all like, who's he? Look him up. You know, or even, you know, I mean, who's an anchor that any of you know? But this notion that there is like somebody who has objectivity. No, no. My perspective, who I am as somebody who became an American by choice, became an American citizen by choice, is as equal and valid as Anderson Cooper, as who else? Who? Katie Couric, as you know, Lester Holt, as any of them. So it's a very disempowering thing to say that just because of where you were born or the kind of background that you have, that somehow this takes away who you are as a journalist. And Alex and I, you know, we just met. We have very different life experiences, but at our core, like at the basic core, we're fellow journalists. We're fellow journalists, and that's the first way that we're gonna interact with each other. And that respect for our profession is something that I think is being challenged now. And probably because, you know, much of the mainstream media in our country has been directed, managed, still, of the mainstream commercial media, decided through a very small group of homogeneous, wealthy white men. Love them. I mean, I love them. You know, they're my buddies. I know many of them. Many of them inspire me. They're friends. Pero óyeme. It's like, you know, we have, like your experience is not more valid as an American than mine is. In fact, if anything, given the demographics, it is, in fact, my experience that you want to know more about, because this is what the future looks like. Anyway, thank you.
Oh, there is so a question I want to ask about that, but I just also want to let it be known that in a few moments we're going to open up questions to the audience. So if you've got one in mind in just a moment, after this next question, you can raise your hand, and we've got two students with microphones who will come by. Maria, the landscape is changing, as you well know. As you mentioned, you were the first Latina to be hired at NPR, and now NPR is doing anything and everything, as are many media organizations, to scramble, to catch up, to find the next big Latina host or Latino reporter. And I'm just curious, from your perspective, decades in this field and in this profession, what is that? Because I'm about feelings too. What does that feel like? Because I would imagine it's a little bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, well, finally, you're paying attention to what I've been saying for so many years. But sometimes I at least question the motives, right? Like, how much is this about really reflecting the experience of the people who live this? How much is it about looking at the advertising dollars and wanting to hit that sweet market of Latinas between the ages of 18 and 35? How does it feel to you?
So it feels validating in that I've been saying this for the longest time, that particularly in public media, where the bulk of my career has been, although I did spend 8 years at CNN, and I said the same thing there, and they also looked at me like, ay, Maria, tú y tus locuras, you always have these ideas about things, you know? What I've been saying is that you need to look at the numbers. I mean, why is my television series called America by the Numbers? Because it's like, look at the numbers. These are the groups that, it's not about, it's not about being nice and fuzzy and politically correct, and that's why we report about, no. This is about being the best journalist that you can be. And if you're looking at who we are as a country, we should be doing a better job of telling these stories. And I would say that part of the reason why we are in the conundrum that we find ourselves, where, about a half of the country or less feels really unheard, is because we haven't done a good enough job of actually talking about this demographic change in a way that feels very organic and authentic and real and not fearful. I think if you think about the way this demographic change and Latinos have been reported about by others, with the binoculars of like, ooh, let's look at these Hispanics, like what's going on? And ooh, let's look at the browning of America, has been like, oh my God, it's happening, what? Ah. Well, in my company, the Futuro Media Group, and in the products that we produce, we don't look at it like that because we are that change, right? So it's more looking at it like, wow, this is really fascinating. Like, let's just report about this. So this is not about doing the nice, fuzzy thing, like just get more Latinos on. This is actually business. And it's not about making money, but it is about understanding that good journalism means telling stories about the America that we are. Not the America that you think we are, but the actual America that we are. It is, it's really great, to be called, oh, one of the most influential Latinas in the media. Yeah, feels good, to be honest with you. That and a quarter doesn't even get me a subway token. There are no subway tokens anyway. They're pass cards, but it's like you can't really do anything with that. Let's remember what has just happened. We have Latinos, Mexican immigrants as being the target point of one of the presidential candidates. And the people behind the power of the presidential debates and the vice presidential debates made a decision to not include us. There's no better way in which to say, yeah, you're still a minority. Are we gonna let you in? We're not gonna let you? I'm not sure. We're not there. Like, it couldn't be clearer, we're not there. Latino journalists have been asking, why is there no Latino in any of the presidential debates? Why is that? And I don't have the answer. There were some rumors out there that potentially the commission just felt like, well, if we put Maria Hinojosa there, she's Mexican, she's an immigrant, she's a woman, Donald Trump will say, I'm not gonna go because she's gonna be biased, and then he'll be able to walk away, and then we won't get the debates. That's what self-censorship looks like, right? What would have happened if, in fact, the debate commission said, well, no, actually, we are gonna put, and it didn't have to be me, it could have been anybody, we're gonna put them there, and you're gonna have to sit down. What would that look like? What would it have looked like in that moment when Donald Trump's security guard, 6'5", walked over to Jorge Ramos and put his hands on him and forced him to walk out of that newsroom, what would have happened if actually my fellow journalists had said, let him speak? He has a legitimate question, let him speak. So you can see that I'm getting all, because it's not like something that might happen or it did happen, or it's happening now, today. In fact, today, right now, at 9:49 Eastern Time, my friend Elaine Quijano, who is a Filipino-American, whose name is Elaine Quijano. And people were like, well, you know, they got a Latino. It's like, no, she's Filipino. You know, did they do that as a kind of like bait and switch? I don't know. But I'll tell you, it does not feel good. And the notion of us still fighting to be a part of the mainstream is real. Yeah, what they don't know is that, you know, a radio show like ours, Latino USA, that's been around now for almost 25 years, so we should be dead, our audience numbers grew in the last year by 39%. Mic drop, boom, you know. Our digital audience grew by like 300%. Boom. So, you know, you don't want to put me up there? Okay. But this is happening. And people are hearing what we're doing. And we are part of the, not part, we are the future of the American conversation. So it's your loss.
Questions from the audience? We have time for a couple. Raise your hand if you've got one. I see a gentleman right down here.
Good evening. Thank you for both being here. I love listening in the morning, Take Two, and I love listening to Latino USA on my commute to Ventura County with all the LA traffic. My name is Alonso Campos. I'm a PhD student here at Claremont Graduate University. So I'm a fan of Latino USA, and one of my favorite parts, I love every episode, but one of my favorite parts is when you say, no se vayan. And it just like speaks to me very like familia. And so I'm just curious, because I was thinking, I need to ask a question. Let me ask a fun question. When you began the show, and that catchphrase, if you will, that's very common in most familias, no se vayan, what went through your mind to say, that's what I want to say? Because I love hearing it. It's just very just warm and welcoming, and majority of my family is in Northern California, so it's very, thank you. So I'm just curious.
That's so sweet. I think I need to start a hashtag, no te vayas. It's very funny. And also I've heard these stories of like little kids walking around saying, no te vayas, no te vayas, no te vayas. And it's funny because, you know, I would love to be able to say, well, we did a lot of focus groups and we did a lot of thinking, and it wasn't. It was like, what would I say? And you know, the Latino USA is not a fully bilingual show, but I do like, you know, in my normal life, I mean, hablo los dos idiomas, and I never know which one is going to come out of my mouth. So it's, and you know, people are saying, sometimes I'll say, well, you know, you said Puerto Rico in one sentence, and you said Puerto Rico in the other. Like, which one is it? And I'm like, it's just the way I talk. I don't know which way it's going to come out. And so the no te vayas was simply like, yeah, like, don't go anywhere, but I wanted to say it in a way that nobody else had, because, you know, in English language radio stations, you hear that all the time. Don't go anywhere. Stay right with us. It's like, well, I wouldn't want to say that, but I could say no te vayas. And so part of what we do want to do in Latino USA and with all of the media that we produce at Futuro Media Group in Harlem is about a kind of casualness, familiarity. I'm right there with you. I mean, we can do that with the writing, but also with the tone of the voice and with certain words that we use. And if there is something that I kind of love of the Latin American journalistic tradition and of the public intellectual tradition of journalists in Latin America, es que se hace medio en familia. Like if you watch Univision, and I haven't been watching much television lately at all, but you know, siempre hay esta cosa como que you're like family. And so I like to do that. That feels very natural. And to me, it does not compromise who we are as journalists. For some in this country, it is. I don't know if we're going to get to the clip, because I love these questions, but you can all watch this clip later. where I actually touch the person who I'm interviewing, and that caused like, what is she doing? I do that actually because comes naturally, but it's actually also something that I learned from a great journalist, Scott Simon, who is not afraid to touch someone, and yet, with all due respect to my friend Scott Simon, who's a white guy, he's never been called on it. So I just really want to make people feel like included. And again, to me that means, me alegro que tú te sientes incluido, but I want to make sure that you feel included, or that you feel included as well. That I'm hoping that people really believe me, that when I say, it's not about just talking to people that I may share something with. Really, the people who I love speaking with the most is the people with whom I share very little. And in that sense, my role becomes somebody of, yeah, see me. Yeah, are you afraid of me, really? Yeah, I'm Mexican. Yeah, imagínate, and we speak Spanish in my home. But do you really fear me? But do you really fear me? And I'm not about creating fear, because none of us are going anywhere in this country. And so we've got to figure out a way of doing this. And in that sense, the no te vayas is stay here with us. There might be some people who actually don't know what no te vayas means. It means don't go away. And it means don't go away because we're right here with you, and I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you. So let's do this together. Thank you for the question.
Sadly, we won't be having time for this clip because Maria's got to catch a plane.
No, but I have time. You can watch the clip
time
later. We'll
one,
tell you how to.
Humanizing America. I definitely encourage you to check it out. She touches someone and no one explodes. Life does, in fact, go on. I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, maybe two or three. Do you guys have to go someplace? I have a red eye to catch, but.
Hi, how are you? My name's Jacqueline. Thank you for having me. I'm a student at the University of Laverne down the street.
Oh, I know University of Laverne. That's down the street?
Yeah.
Oh, well, hey, say hello to the president for me. She's very nice. Actually, seriously, go to the office and say, hey, Maria Hinojosa. I didn't realize we're so close. It's a very interesting place, University of Laverne.
Well, thank you for having me here. So I like how you mentioned how you're a journalist, and recently I attended a book reading with Jorge Ramos, and he spoke about how he's a journalist and how people accuse him of being an activist. So I wanted to ask you, how do you go about doing your job and reporting without actually wanting to when somebody says something that may hurt you or the people that you represent, how do you react?
I listen. When I'm in my role as a journalist, when I'm interviewing somebody, it is not my job to, at that point, say, what you've just said is hurting me as a Mexican woman. And no. And I have to give this person, I have to be able to look at them and have them understand that I really am 100% interested in what they're saying to me. My role in that moment, I'm going to question, when I was interviewing the women from South Texas who are Donald Trump supporters, of course I'm going to just be like, but tell me again, but explain to me how you, because that's what I'm trying to understand. But it's not about my judgment at all. So I can ask tough questions, but they're not about carrying my judgment. And it's hard for me to explain, but I know Alex knows what I'm talking about. You'll know when a question that you're asking is coming from a place of, I'm judging you. And that's not my role. I remember when I was reporting about South Dakota anti-abortion law that was, at that point, the strictest statewide anti-abortion law. And I was interviewing the man who wrote the legislation, who was an older man, and the legislation was to outlaw every kind of abortion except in the possibility of the life of the mother. And it had to be like super proven that the life of the mother was in danger. And, you know, he said, when I asked him that question about like, but I mean, a young girl who's a victim of incest? Help me to understand how you believe that she should have to carry that baby to term. And he said, well, you know, it doesn't really matter who the father is. Doesn't, you know, there was a life that was created, and we have to respect that life. And other people in my life, when they heard that I had done that interview, they were like, but how did you do that? Didn't you want to, like, what? And by the way, full disclosure, I have had 2 abortions. It's out there in the public. I don't hide it. And yet, millions of years ago, by the way. But people would say, how could you do that? And I'm like, that's my job. That's what I do. That's what Alex does. That is what a journalist does, actually, is that we have to be able to listen without judgment. Doesn't mean we don't ask tough questions, but you listen without judgment. And so it's not about me personally. I'm going to tell you, truthfully, there was one occasion, and I'm kind of going to reveal, but okay, where I was in the backseat of a cab, and by the way, I ask everybody, you know, who I'm with, who they're voting for, like, this is what I do, and this particular man was African American. He didn't know who I was, had no clue who I was, and he told me that he wanted to vote for Trump. He was in Georgia. And I remember just saying to him, like, and this was the one time where I did get out, and that's why I'm telling you, because it just happens very, very, very rarely. But I knew he had no idea who I was. And I did speak to him from my heart. And it was a weird space for me, but something happened in that moment where I just said, you know, the person who made me believe in this country more than anyone, I said, that person looked like you. His name was Martin Luther King. And he made me feel like I could be a part of this country. And so for you as an African-American man to say that you want to support somebody who says that they want to deport me, someone like me, I said, that just, you know, it hurts my heart. And he just said, oh my gosh, I had no idea. I had no idea. And I said, well, did you hear what he said about Mexicans? He was like, no. I was like, okay, well, that was like, wow. So certain people are just hearing things that they want to hear. And I just tell you that because it was one of those places and times where I was like, I just have to. And I don't know what happened with him, but I actually encourage people in general. One of the things that I'm saying now out there in my speeches is to allow yourself to get into those places of discomfort and to have those conversations. And to allow ourselves to be there. We're not going to kill each other. We have to be able to understand where we're coming from. And so that is the nature of who I am. And it's not about my heart and what I'm feeling when I'm in my job. It's not about that. I mean, it is about my heart because I feel like you all feel my heart. But it's not about my judgment. It is about my heart, but it's not about my judgment. And I think that's why I'm a good journalist. Which is why I've won all kinds of awards named after white men.
I think we could, such a good note to end on, but we could take one more question, and there's a gentleman up there in the back. We'll leave it with him.
Ruben Navarrete Jr. wrote a piece on Trump, Latinos for Trump a couple days ago. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you were doing some research on it yourself, and he summarized the piece on Latinos for Trump as a group of mostly charlatans, hucksters, and clowns. I'm wondering whether the research that you're doing is similar.
That Latinos who support Trump are charlatans, hucksters, or
clowns.
No, I would never. I would never make a generalization like that at all. I really wouldn't. And again, for me, it's not about making those generalizations. It's really an absolute curiosity about what's going on for them. And I think that that is insulting, and I think that that is disempowering to them, and I'm not trying to do that. I want to understand them. I need to understand them. And that would be...
In his piece, he mentions if he wins, we're going to get the taco truck in every corner. I don't know that you read his...
Of course. Well, we're trying to understand him, why he said that, because that's just, first of all, I'm not remembering his name, Marco, but you know, I mean, the facts are that él tiene muchos problemas, óyeme, I mean, he's like, so the fact that he is somehow seen as a Trump surrogate is like, whoa, really? I mean, he has, I don't have the facts in front of me, but you know, there's been bankruptcies, there have been, I think there's been some fraud, I think, so it's like, you know, I don't understand him as a surrogate. And him, so am I gonna, I mean, him, yeah, you know, maybe he's a charlatan and a huckster, yes, but he's a surrogate for Trump. And that's different than Trump supporters out there in general. And again, for them, I just want to understand better where they're coming from, and I would not categorize them as that. This gentleman, if I was sparring with him, that would be a lot of fun, and we could get into it deeply, but he's a Trump surrogate, and I would treat him in a different way than if I was interviewing a Latino or Latina who is a Trump supporter. Not a great way to end. I think you're right.
We should have stopped one question earlier. So first and foremost, thank you all for coming. But more importantly even, thank you so much, Alex. That was a phenomenal set of questions that got us to be able to also
She's got
thank...
like 20 more
I
there.
know. We only wish we could have a couple more hours. But Maria, thank you. Your answers were provocative and thoughtful. And thank you once again
Can
for
I do
coming.
one last thing? Before you leave, I really hope that you take a moment and go to, this is shameless self-promotion, but this is how it works. Wherever you get your podcasts, that you subscribe to Latino USA, that you subscribe to In the Thick, which is a political podcast that we created this year because we stopped being invited to be on other people's political shows like Meet the Press, and so we just created our own. It's called In the Thick, and we're actually surpassing, in terms of popularity, shows like Meet the Press on the podcast, so take that. Also, AmericaByTheNumbers.org is our television work, so you can see what we're reporting in terms of you know, new electorates and how they're going to impact the presidential election. And finally, what we were going to show here is a series of shorts called HumanizingAmerica.org. And you can find them. If you find me on social media, you can link to them, and I really would hope that you watch and listen to the work that we're doing and support it and tell your friends to support it too. It means a lot to us. And thank you so much for being here. I take all of this love back with me to New York and Harlem, and I'll share it with my team. Thank you. And thank you, Alex.